She's the disgrace of this family, always has been. That's what my mother said about me at my sister's wedding right before they placed me at a table behind a column like I was part of the furniture. Except, I was the one who pulled her new husband from a collapsed building in Syria with shrapnel in my leg. I'm Althea Rourke, 45, a major general in the U.S. Army, and I've been erased by my own blood for years. Like, comment or subscribe. Here's what really happened. They never saw me for who I was. Not as a soldier, not as a leader. Certainly not as their daughter or sister. To them, I was a uniform that wouldn't sit down. A mouth that wouldn't stay shut. A reminder of everything they'd tried to keep quiet and small. Even now, 3 decades and 4 stars later, they still hadn't changed. I sat alone in my office at the Pentagon, the low hum of the building's artificial stillness pressing into the evening. The others had gone home hours ago. A half-finished stack of reports lay ignored on my desk. Instead, I stared at the clean white envelope in front of me. No return label. Just my name typed neatly in black serif font, Althea Rourke. No title, no rank, not even a Ms. Just the name they'd used when they wanted to remind me who I used to be. Who they preferred, I still was. I didn't need to open it. I already knew. But I did. Inside a formal card, embossed lettering, gold edges. The kind of paper you save receipts in, not memories. My sister Melinda was getting married. The ceremony would take place in Virginia next month at some historic venue near Old Town. A small reception to follow. Formal attire requested. As I lifted the card from the envelope, a smaller slip of paper fluttered to the floor. I picked it up, recognizing the handwriting before I even read the words. Please behave. That was all it said. No, dear Althea. No, love, Mom. Just 2 words from my mother in that same rigid cursive that once wrote my excuses for gym class in 6th grade. Back then it meant I should smile and nod when my uncle made jokes that weren't funny. Now it meant don't embarrass us. Or maybe more accurately, don't be yourself. I ran a hand through my hair, short now, practical. The kind of cut that doesn't need mirrors. I stood walking to the window that overlooked the parking lot just in time to watch the last security car make its rounds. Beyond that, the glow of Arlington shimmered against the fading skyline. For 9 years, I hadn't seen them. Not since the funeral. When my father died, I came straight from a combat briefing in Qatar. My dress blues still smelled faintly of the desert sand clinging to the seams like ghosts. I arrived at the church and took my place in the back, unacknowledged, uninvited to the photos taken by the casket. Melinda had worn white to the funeral. Said she didn't own anything black. My mother clutched her pearls like they were rosary beads. I said nothing. Just watched them laugh between snapshots. That day, I promised myself I wouldn't try again. No calls, no visits. Just the kind of silence that tells you exactly where you stand. And yet now here was this invitation. No olive branch, no apology. Just a line drawn in calligraphy and a handwritten reminder not to step over it. I turned the card over in my hands, the edges stiff like a dress code. Melinda Rourke marrying Reed Kavanaugh. I read the name again slower this time. It didn't feel real. Couldn't be. Captain Reed Kavanaugh. I hadn't heard his name in years, but I'd never forget it. Syria, 2015. Safe house collapse. Fire and concrete and blood in my throat. I'd pulled him out of a room caving in on itself, his leg pinned beneath a support beam. I was bleeding from the side, a piece of rebar in my calf. But I still carried him out. I used my belt as a tourniquet and my will as a stretcher. He passed out before the medevac arrived. Never saw me again. Probably didn't remember. I remembered everything. Even now I could feel the scar itching like it always did when memories pressed too hard. I limped for 6 months after that. My superior said I could have taken a desk job. I didn't. What I never expected was that he would end up engaged to her. The knock on my door was soft but firm. I turned. Brigadier General Royce Calder leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You going to open it?" he asked. "I already did." He stepped inside, nodding at the envelope. "Family sister's getting married. Nice." "Sure." He tilted his head. "You haven't seen them in a while, right? Not since the funeral." Royce didn't say anything for a moment. He just let the silence do its work. "Do they know what you've done since he asked, finally?" "They don't want to." "You going—" I hesitated. "I don't know. What would I even be going for? A seat in the corner? A line in the guest book? Maybe a photo I won't be in?" He shrugged. "Maybe you go to remind them who you are." I didn't answer. My eyes drifted back to the card. Melinda Rourke. Reed Kavanaugh. Of all the men in the world, it had to be the one who owed me his life. I turned the slip of paper over again in my fingers. "Please behave." I felt a flicker rise in my chest. Not anger exactly, something older, colder. The kind of thing you carry with you through deployments and debriefings and dusty briefcases that never seem to empty. I looked back at Royce. "I think I'll go," I said. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was shrinking. I didn't respond to the invitation that night. I didn't rip it up either. I left it on my desk like a classified file waiting for clearance, too dangerous to ignore, too familiar to act on. By morning, my aide spotted it. Lieutenant Gage was sharp, loyal, and delightfully nosy. "Who's getting married?" he asked, standing in the doorway with a mug that read, "This coffee is classified." "My sister," I said without looking up. Gage blinked. "Didn't even know you had a sister. That makes two of us." He raised an eyebrow, stepped closer. "Wait, is this a real invitation? Or some kind of scam? No rank, no salutation, no nothing." I held up the note. "Please behave." He stared at it, then at me. "That's it." I nodded. "That's some hallmark warmth right there." I cracked a small smile despite myself. Gage leaned against the edge of my desk. "You going?" I didn't answer. Just flipped the card closed and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't press. That was something I appreciated about military people. We understood the weight of silence. By late afternoon, I was reviewing deployment rosters in my private office when General Royce Calder stepped in unannounced. He never knocked. Not out of arrogance, but because protocol didn't scare him. "I heard you got an invitation," he said casually. I didn't ask how. The Pentagon was like a high school with artillery secrets rarely stayed secret. "Wedding?" I said, barely glancing up. "Melinda," he asked. "Yeah." He nodded, folding his arms. "I take it she didn't ask you to be maid of honor." I gave a dry laugh. "Are you going?" "I haven't decided." He paused, then took the seat across from me, settling in like this wasn't a passing conversation. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "Why subject yourself to a room full of people who spent years pretending you don't exist?" I looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I understand what it's like to be cut out by family," he continued. "But I do know what it's like to walk into a room where you're not wanted. And I also know this. You earned the right to stand in any room, Althea, even the ones that tried to lock you out." There it was, that rare thing. Respect without pity. "I'm not going to beg for a seat at their table," I said. "Don't. Sit at your own. And let them look up to you for once." I sat with that for a while after he left. I didn't make any grand declarations. I didn't need to. I just reached into the drawer, pulled out my personnel pass folder, and requested personal leave for 72 hours. Then I booked a red-eye to Reagan International, civilian alias. No driver, no fanfare. Everything I needed fit in one carry-on bag, a change of clothes, a pressed dress uniform, and a pair of polished shoes I hadn't worn since the Medal of Valor ceremony 2 years ago. I checked in under the name Leah R. Quinn, a combination of my grandmother's name and the alias I used during humanitarian extractions overseas. It felt appropriate. By the time I reached the terminal, the airport was half asleep. Businessmen in wrinkled suits scrolled through emails. A toddler screamed over a tablet. Somewhere behind me, a janitor whistled out of tune. I liked it. Nobody looked at me twice. The gate agent scanned my boarding pass without comment. I took my seat near the window far from the aisle, paid extra to keep the middle one empty. The night outside was heavy with rain, casting ribbons of water down the glass like veins. As I settled in, my phone buzzed. A text from Gage FYI Military Watch is asking if you're attending the wedding of Captain Reed Kavanaugh. Apparently someone leaked the guest list. Attached was a blurry screenshot of a headline, "Decorated Soldiers May Reunite at High-Profile D.C. Wedding." I stared at it for a long moment, not out of fear but calculation. The story wasn't about me. Not yet. But it could be. They were watching. I powered off my phone. The flight attendant offered me champagne when she saw the insignia patch on my carry-on. I declined, asked for water instead. As the plane rose into the dark sky, I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to steady myself. I wasn't flying into combat. I'd done that. I knew what it meant to risk your life for something greater than yourself. This was different. This was family. And family was a battlefield that didn't have protocols or mission briefings or rules of engagement. Just landmines wrapped in good intentions and secrets nobody wanted unearthed. But this time, I wasn't going in to fight. I was going in to be seen. The Virginia spring air had a softness to it, honeysuckle and wet grass birdsong wrapped in the low hum of suburbia. It should have felt nostalgic. It didn't. I turned off the main road onto Birch Hollow Drive, my childhood street now lined with identical manicured lawns and tulip beds arranged like parade formations. My mother's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, just as stiff and symmetrical as I remembered. White shutters, fresh mulch, not a single weed out of place. A shrine to appearances. I pulled into the driveway behind a pristine silver SUV and killed the engine. No butterflies, no nerves. Just the steady awareness of returning to a war zone, one that served hors d'oeuvres and spoke in passive-aggressive undertones. I didn't knock. I wanted to. But I couldn't give her that satisfaction, the image of me uncertain on her front step like a prodigal begging to be let back in. I rang the bell once and waited, hands at my sides, back straight. The door opened with a whisper. Doreen Rourke stood there in cream slacks and a silk blouse, her hair twisted into a perfect coil, makeup delicate and untouched despite the hour. She looked me over head to toe with the same cool gaze she used to use on my report cards, as if searching for flaws to annotate. "I see you got the invitation," she said. "I did." She stepped back but didn't move aside. "I hope you remembered something appropriate to wear," she added, voice light but loaded. "I brought my uniform." A pause. Subtle but not silent. Her nostrils flared just slightly. Not enough to acknowledge discomfort. Just enough to prove it existed. She didn't respond, just turned and walked inside. I followed. The house hadn't changed. The same lemon polish on every surface. The same grandfather clock that had never worked but was always dusted. The same chandelier in the foyer still missing the same bulb from a decade ago. As if daring anyone to notice imperfection, it smelled like lavender and obligation. "Melinda's out," Doreen said over her shoulder. "Spa appointment, wedding prep." "Of course." She led me down the hallway, heels clicking in rhythm, voice clipped like she was reciting a guest itinerary. "You'll be in the west guest room. There's an extra key in the drawer if you need to lock up anything." Sensitive. The dig was unmissable. We stopped at a door I remembered from childhood, once a study, then storage, now apparently my quarters. "We're keeping things simple," she continued, opening it. "Rehearsal dinner tomorrow, ceremony the day after. You'll need to be dressed and seated before guests arrive. No processional for the family." I asked, light as paper. "You're not part of the wedding party," she said, not missing a beat. Of course not. The room was immaculate. Beige carpet, white linens, a single hydrangea in a vase by the bed like a peace offering that hadn't been agreed upon. There was no photograph, no welcome note, No trace that I had ever lived or mattered here. "I hope this is sufficient," Doreen said, standing in the doorway like a hotel concierge who'd rather you booked elsewhere. "It's perfect," I said. I placed my carry-on on the floor and unzipped it slowly. My uniform was still wrapped in its garment bag. Crease's sharp metals tucked inside their box like secrets that demanded daylight. I hung it in the closet. Let it settle into the silence. Behind me, Doreen cleared her throat. "I expect you to understand how important this weekend is for Melinda." Of course. She's worked very hard to put this together. The press may attend. The press, a few local outlets. Family interest, you know. She and Reed are a success story. Soldier and sweetheart. The irony pressed against my teeth. "She's marrying a man whose life I once saved," I said. Did she ever mention that Doreen's lips thinned? She mentioned something vague. But this weekend isn't about past deployments. It's about her future and our family. I turned toward her fully, then letting the words fall like slow ammunition. Then maybe she shouldn't have invited the disgrace of the family. Doreen froze, not completely, just in the way a trained performer hesitates before recovering her line. "I never called you that." "No," I said. "You just let other people say it." Silence hung between us, taut and shallow. She folded her hand's wedding band, catching the light. "We want this weekend to go smoothly. No drama, no surprises. I trust that won't be a problem." It wasn't a question. It never was. "I've never been the one who causes scenes," I said quietly. She gave a tight nod, then left, closing the door behind her with practiced grace. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the stillness settle in. This room was a holding cell, a place to be parked and forgotten. They hadn't invited me to participate, they'd invited me to disappear politely. But this time I wouldn't. I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't pick fights over centerpieces or seating charts. No, this time I would be seen. Not because they allowed it, because I had earned it. The country club sat on a hill outside Alexandria, a brick colonial structure that wore its history like a designer scarf, expensive, intentional, and just the right amount of frayed at the edges to feel authentic. Whitewashed columns framed the entrance, and inside the walls were lined with oil paintings of men who had probably signed things in quill pens and owned land that once wasn't theirs. The kind of place where legacy mattered more than truth. The maitre d' greeted Doreen like old money. I followed a few paces behind, unacknowledged, like a shadow brought along for protocol. Inside the dining hall, everything gleamed. Chandeliers, twinkled silverware was lined with military precision, and name cards sat like judgments waiting to be read. I scanned the long, curved table that wrapped in a half moon around the dais where Melinda and Reed would sit. My card waited at the far end, right beside the service door. A. Rourke. No rank, no title. Just a floating initial like an afterthought. I pulled out the chair, the fabric still warm from the kitchen draft that blew past every few seconds. It smelled faintly of garlic and lemon polish. From my vantage point, I could see the entire room, and none of it saw me. The seats filled quickly. Melinda's bridesmaids fluttered in silk pastels, laughing too loudly at inside jokes curated for volume. My Uncle Charles poured himself a third glass of rosé before the appetizers were served. Doreen drifted from guest to guest like a conductor of small talk, tuning each conversation to the key of superficial perfection. Then the double doors at the front opened. Melinda entered like a queen descending her staircase. Ivory silk wrapped her like a second skin hair swept into a low chignon. She wore pearls, our grandmothers, and they caught the chandelier light with every step. Her smile widened as guests turned and stood a ripple of applause greeting her entrance. She glided past my chair without looking, wrapping her arms around Uncle Charles like he'd just returned from a war zone instead of the golf course. "Darling," he said, beaming, "you look like royalty." "I feel like it." She laughed. I sipped my water, chilled and sharp. Reed followed behind her, tall, clean-cut, quiet. His eyes scanned the room and landed on me for the briefest second. Something flickered. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. But then it passed, and he kissed Melinda's hand like a man following orders. The servers began pouring wine. My glass stayed empty. I flagged one down, lifting a hand. "Non-drinking guest," he said, checking a clipboard. I nodded, then leaned slightly into the aisle and reached for the nearest bottle at the next table. I poured it myself, slow and deliberate. No one noticed. The first course arrived tiny beet salads with edible flowers that tasted like wet leaves. A woman across from me leaned in politely. "So, Althea," she said, "what do you do now?" "Still active." Before I could answer, Doreen appeared like a weather front voice, cool and dismissive. "Althea's doing some consulting now. Overseas. Private security, I believe." "Oh, how interesting," the woman said, trying to sound impressed. Melinda chimed in from 2 seats away without looking. "She guards important doors," she said with a smirk. "We think." Laughter bubbled around the table. Light, dismissive, practiced. I didn't respond. I didn't smile. I reached for my wine and took a measured sip. "I imagine that's very dangerous," the woman added weakly. "Sometimes," I said. Before she could ask more, a man seated 3 spots down narrowed his eyes at me. Silver-haired, straight-backed despite age. His suit was formal, understated, the kind of man who'd worn a uniform long before he wore a blazer. "Were you in brake light?" he asked, voice low and steady. The question pierced the room. I turned to him fully this time. "Yes, sir. 2015 Syria. West Quadrant collapse. Chemical spill in Sector 9. "That's right." He stared for a moment, then nodded once. "I remember the report. You pulled 2 men out while injured." 3, I corrected gently. Doreen's voice cut through the moment like a knife through fabric. "So dessert," she said brightly. "We have 2 options, lemon tart or chocolate soufflé. I hope everyone filled out their cards." The older man leaned back in his chair, his eyes still on me but his mouth closed. The conversation moved on. Just like that. I felt my jaw clench once before releasing. The second course came and went. Melinda toasted to love to read, to the kind of family that lifts each other up, which earned her another round of applause. Doreen dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed napkin like the moment moved her. It didn't. Reed barely spoke. When the evening wrapped, people filtered toward valet lines and the waiting firelight of their cars. I stood from my seat, shoulders square, and turned toward the door. As I passed Colonel Jett, because that's who he was, I remembered now he touched my arm gently. "You were one of the best field commanders we had," he said quietly. "Still are. Thank you, sir." He looked toward Melinda and Doreen, then back at me. "They don't know who you are." "They will," I said. And I meant it. The church looked like it had been pulled from a colonial postcard whitewashed brick, glowing in the morning light. Iron gates swung wide with wreaths of pale hydrangeas and stained glass windows, casting soft ribbons of color onto the cobblestone path. A sign near the entrance read, "St. Margaret's Episcopal, Est, 1791. I arrived early. Not because I was expected to, but because I refused to be rushed. The sanctuary was empty, but humming with preparation. Florists adjusted arrangements like they were solving puzzles. A string quartet rehearsed in whispers, and the wedding planner paced up and down the aisle like a general scanning a battlefield. I walked through the front door in full dress blues. Rows of medals glinted softly across my chest. Ribbons aligned. Hair tied back in the same simple knot I'd worn under my helmet in 4 countries. I wasn't here to decorate the room. I wasn't here to be polite. I was here because I had earned the right to exist in this story. The seating chart stood on an easel in the foyer, encased in gold trim and printed on thick pearlescent paper. Each name was written in flowing calligraphy, Melinda and Reed's wedding guests, and arranged by table like it was a royal banquet. I scanned the chart slowly. Table 1, immediate family. Table 2, wedding party. Table 3 through 12, friends, cousins, military guests. Then, bottom right corner squeezed in like an afterthought A. Rourke. Table 13, Fire exit added in pen. Not typed, not even written in the same ink. Just scribbled like someone remembered me at the last minute or wished they hadn't. I stared at it long enough to memorize it. That's when I heard her behind me. "It's quieter back there for everyone's sake," Doreen said, her tone smooth as satin. I turned to face her. She was wrapped in dove-gray chiffon, her pearls resting neatly above a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gaze dropped briefly to my uniform, then snapped back up like it offended her to look too long. "You look very official," she said. I held her stare. "I am." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue, just turned and vanished into the flurry of preparations. The sanctuary began to fill. Women in pastel dresses, men in tailored suits, perfume floating like fog across the pews. Laughter rose in polite bubbles as old friends reunited and second cousins posed for photos under the stained glass. No one greeted me. No one nodded in my direction. I took my seat at the end of the third pew, close enough to see, far enough to avoid being seen. The music shifted. Guests rose. The doors at the back opened with theatrical precision. Melinda stood framed in sunlight, one hand on Doreen's arm, the other holding a bouquet of lilies and soft pink roses. Her dress shimmered like starlight, sleeveless, backless, flawless. A veil cascaded down her spine like a bridal waterfall. Every camera clicked. She began her descent, each step measured, practiced. She looked straight ahead, never glancing left or right. The crowd sighed audibly, as if collectively acknowledging her perfection. At the altar, Reed waited in a fitted tux, hands folded, expression unreadable. The string quartet played something classical and slow, and Melinda moved like she was part of the arrangement. Not walking, floating. The priest welcomed the guests with warmth and flair. He spoke of love and commitment and journeys shared. Then he looked out over the pews. "At this time, we invite the immediate family to come forward and join the couple for a special blessing." I stood without thinking, not out of defiance, out of instinct. I was her sister. That was supposed to mean something. But before I could step into the aisle, I felt a light, firm brush on my arm. Doreen's fingers rested just above my elbow. "This moment isn't about you," she whispered. Her breath was warm. Her voice was sweet, almost maternal. Almost. I turned and looked at her. She didn't blink. I looked ahead at Melinda, kneeling now beside Reed, her dress pooled around her like a monument. And I sat back down. The priest continued. The guests smiled. The blessing moved forward without interruption. But the air around me shifted. Across the aisle, a woman frowned in my direction. Behind me, I heard someone whisper, "Wasn't that her sister?" I didn't move. Let them wonder. Let them see what silence looks like when it's forced on someone who has commanded battalions and carried bloodied soldiers through smoke. Let them sit in it. The blessing ended. Vows were exchanged. Rings were slipped onto trembling fingers. Applause erupted at the kiss. Melinda beamed. Reed didn't smile. As the guests filed out for photos and cocktails, I stayed seated until the sanctuary emptied. Then I rose slowly and walked down the aisle, not behind them, not for pictures, but toward the fire exit where table 13 waited, where they had placed me, where I was never meant to be seen. But they had made one mistake. They made me visible by trying to hide me. And now the hiding was over. The reception hall was a ballroom dressed in silk and silence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead like they were trying too hard. Every table had white linens folded into perfect angles, every chair wrapped in satin bows like presents waiting to be opened. Table 13 was tucked behind a floral column near the side exit, barely within view of the dance floor, close enough to the catering station to catch every swing of the kitchen door. My place card read A. Rourke, still no rank. The napkin at my setting didn't match the other's navy instead of ivory. A small detail, but deliberate. A fingerprint left at the scene. I sat down composed and still watching the room fill. The bridal party entered to applause. Melinda floated in dress glimmering with every movement a constellation in white. She kissed relatives, laughed at jokes before they finished, posed like she was made of flashbulbs and flattery. Doreen followed regal in slate chiffon, one hand grazing shoulders, the other clutching a glass of rosé like a scepter. I watched them both without blinking. A waiter came by with a tray of champagne flutes. He skipped me. "Excuse me," I said softly. "May I have one?" He checked, his list eyes scanning. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're marked as a non-drinking guest." "I'm not." He hesitated, then walked away. I stood, stepped toward the next table, and poured my own glass from the bottle left uncorked by a half-drunk uncle, too busy retelling army tales he'd read in a Tom Clancy novel. Someone at table 10 noticed. A woman in a beaded dress leaned to her companion, murmuring behind a lifted menu. "Let them." I returned to my seat just as the lights dimmed and the DJ tapped the mic twice. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" The crowd settled into a hush. Melinda stepped into the center of the room, champagne flute in hand, glowing under the spotlight. She didn't just smile, she performed it. To love, she said, her voice lilting. To loyalty. To the kind of family that stands with you, not just when things are easy, but when it matters most. Scattered applause. Camera flashes. She turned toward my corner of the room. Her gaze swept past me, then doubled back with choreographed charm. "And even our quiet sentinel made it today," she said sweetly. "My sister, who still guards those mysterious doors, I suppose." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, soft, performative, a shared joke delivered like an hors d'oeuvre. Melinda grinned wider. Really, I wasn't sure she'd come. But here she is, looking sharp as always. More chuckles. And maybe someday she'll even tell us what it is she actually does. Unless it's still top secret. A louder laugh this time, pity disguised as amusement. I didn't move. Then Doreen, from her seat at the head table, lifted her glass and added in a crisp, clipped tone, "She may be the family's shame, but at least she showed up on time." It landed like a slap, muffled by applause. The air changed. Not suddenly, but tangibly. Like a pressure drop before a storm. I rose, not abruptly, not in protest, just slow, deliberate, like a tide coming in. Forks stilled. A clink echoed from a glass that hit its plate too hard. A few heads turned, then more. The laughter faded. Across the room, Melinda tilted her head. Her smile didn't falter, but the corners trembled. "Oh, come on," she said. "It's a joke. Lighten up, Althea. You always take things so seriously." I held my glass in one hand, the other resting lightly against the chair behind me. My uniform caught the chandelier light and threw it back in silence. I didn't speak. Not yet. Because silence used properly is not submission. It's strategy. And in that moment, before the room could catch its breath, before anyone could redirect the narrative, I became the one thing they hadn't planned for. Visible. The woman they placed by the fire exit had risen, and the room, whether it wanted to or not, had turned to face her. The silence after Melinda's joke was louder than any explosion I'd heard in the field. Every eye in the room was on me, though no one seemed to know quite what to do with their hands. Champagne glasses hovered mid-sip. Forks froze above plates. A few guests looked to Doreen as if she could summon the next line of the script. She couldn't. I remained standing perfectly still, my spine as straight as a rifle's edge. I didn't flinch. I didn't smirk. I didn't perform discomfort for their forgiveness. I had stood in too many deserts with too many dying men to bow under the weight of a wedding toast. Then I saw movement at the head table. Reed Kavanaugh stood. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped around his untouched plate, adjusted his cuffs, and began walking across the ballroom. No hurry, no hesitation. Just the kind of quiet momentum that draws attention even when it doesn't ask for it. Melinda watched him go, her expression cracking by the inch. Her smile faltered. One hand still gripped the microphone, the other reached out for his sleeve. He didn't stop. By the time he reached me, the entire room had turned in their seats. He stopped exactly 1 pace away, heels clicking together with trained precision. Then he saluted. A crisp, formal, unmistakable salute, shoulder-back palm, angled down sharp as a blade. "Ma'am," he said, voice clear. "Please forgive my wife." I blinked once but said nothing. He turned to the guests, his voice carrying not from volume but certainty. "This is Major General Althea Rourke. She didn't just serve, she saved my life." Syria, 2015. I was trapped under rubble after a safe house collapse. I had a shattered femur, a collapsed lung. She dragged me out under fire with shrapnel in her leg. A wave of audible gasps rippled through the room. Melinda's arm fell to her side. The mic slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull, echoing clack. Doreen rose to her feet, pale as the tablecloths. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The silence cracked again. From table 2, just behind the orchestra, Colonel Marlon Jett rose next. No hesitation. He squared his shoulders and raised his hand. Then another, a woman in a navy blue cocktail dress, stepped forward, heels clicking. She wore a small silver pin on her chest, Air Force. Retired. She saluted slowly, deliberately. From the back of the room, a man with a cane stood, spine bent but steady. Former West Point instructor, judging by the crest on his lapel. He raised a trembling hand in salute. One by one they rose. Not all in uniform, some in suits, some in dresses, some unknown to me, but they knew me, and they saluted. The clatter of cutlery stopped altogether. Nobody was sipping now. Nobody was laughing. Doreen looked around the room, her neck stiff, her eyes darting for someone to save her from the shift she could no longer control. "This isn't the time," she whispered, as if that mattered. But no one listened. For the first time in years, I wasn't the question mark on the invitation list. I wasn't the inconvenience by the exit or the burden to be hidden behind flowers and formality. I was the axis around which the room now turned. I didn't return the salutes. That wasn't protocol for civilians, and this wasn't about ritual. It was about recognition. I looked at Reed, still standing beside me, hand now at his side. His eyes met mine. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." I nodded once. Melinda had collapsed into a chair, her arms limp, her expression unreadable. Shock, shame, maybe regret. Maybe just disbelief that her own story had rewritten itself before she finished telling it. Doreen sank back down, fingers trembling as she reached for a wine glass that wasn't there. A single round of applause broke the silence. Then another. Then the whole room erupted, not loud, not wild, but sustained, respectful, real. And in that quiet storm of recognition, I stood as I always had, upright, unwavering, uninvited but undeniable. They hadn't planned for me to rise, but I did, and now they could no longer pretend I hadn't. The reception had ended in a fog of unfinished speeches and rearranged loyalties. The music never started again. Melinda never returned to the microphone. A second round of champagne was poured, but it stayed untouched on most tables. Guests filed out slower than they'd come in, speaking in quieter tones, casting sidelong glances toward me as they passed. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. I left before the cake was cut. Back at the hotel, I crossed the marble lobby just as the evening manager lit the fireplace near the entryway. A concierge smiled nervously. I nodded back, aware of the ripple my uniform still sent through civilian space. Even without the salute, the shift was complete. I stepped into the elevator alcove, pressed the button, and waited. Althea. Her voice hadn't changed, still polished, still controlled. I turned slowly. Doreen approached like she was walking onto a stage. Same pearls, same posture. But now her lipstick was faded, and one of her heels tapped slightly off tempo. She folded her hands. "You certainly made your point tonight." I said nothing. "The phones have already started ringing. Local media. One outlet from D.C., she added, as if reading a guest list aloud. Apparently, someone posted a video of the moment. The elevator dinged, but I didn't step in. She moved closer, lowering her voice. If you could issue a short statement, just a few words. Clarify your role. For the family's sake. A pause. For Melinda's sake. I blinked once. You mean for your reputation? Doreen's jaw tensed. We just weren't prepared, she said softly. We didn't understand your career meant so much. There it was. The rewrite, the reframe, the desperate grasp at plausible innocence. But I wasn't a child anymore. And I had spent too many years learning how power speaks when it's cornered. I took a step toward her. No, I said, my voice low but steel-laced. You understood. You just didn't care. She flinched, just barely. I sent photos, I continued. When I got promoted. When I received the Silver Star. When I was sworn in by the Secretary of Defense. You never responded. That's not... You knew exactly what I'd earned. You just didn't think it counted. She opened her mouth. Closed it again. I looked at her, really looked. At the tight line of her mouth. At the hand gripping her purse strap just a little too hard. At the face of a woman who had spent her life orchestrating silence only to watch it unravel in a ballroom of witnesses. I won't issue a statement, I said. Not for you, not for her, not for the optics. Doreen straightened, summoning the last of her composure. I just thought you'd want a chance to explain yourself, in your own words. I let that hang. Then I stepped around her. As I reached the archway leading toward the elevators again, I turned back one last time. Doreen, I said quietly. She looked up, startled to hear her name from my mouth. I spent half my life shrinking for your comfort. That era ends tonight. And I walked away. No drama, no raised voice, just truth delivered without apology. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside alone. As they closed, I caught a final glimpse of her standing in the center of the lobby. Hands at her sides, mouth slightly open, no longer the woman who held the room. For the first time in our lives, I had taken up space she could not control, and I had done it without permission. 2 weeks later, I stood behind a podium under the Pentagon seal, not in uniform, but in a charcoal gray suit. No ribbons, no medals, no visible rank, just me. The auditorium was full, not of journalists or political figures, but soldiers, veterans, officers still serving, civilians who loved someone in uniform. The kind of crowd that didn't need background explanations to understand the gravity of what wasn't said. I looked out across the rows of faces, some curious, some tired, some scarred in the quiet ways trauma leaves its mark not on skin, but on trust. I took a breath. There are protocols for wounds sustained in combat, I began. For grief, for trauma, for loss. A few heads nodded. Others sat still waiting. But what do we offer those betrayed not by enemies, but by their own families? A silence dropped like a curtain. The service members who came home not to yellow ribbons, but to whispered insults, who were told they were too much, too intense, too inconvenient to love, who were told to shrink, to be polite, to stay quiet because visibility made others uncomfortable. I paused. In the last 20 years, we've built programs for almost everything: reintegration, therapy, education. But there is still no protocol for what it feels like to be erased by the very people who are supposed to see you first. That's when I introduced it. The Sentinel Foundation, a resource for those who serve and come home to silence. For those disowned, discredited, or displaced by the people meant to lift them. For those who still wear the emotional armor long after the uniform comes off. No names were mentioned. Not Melinda, not Doreen. I didn't have to. The headlines had filled in the blanks. The ballroom footage had made its way online. A military blogger dissected the moment frame by frame. The salute that broke the room. The clip had been viewed over 8 million times. But I wasn't there to relive the moment. I was there to make sure no one had to stand in that silence alone again. When the speech ended, I didn't linger. I didn't take questions. I thanked the audience, stepped off the stage, and walked straight out the side exit into a waiting sedan. By the end of the week, my retirement papers were finalized. I didn't do a press tour, no farewell parade, no final photos in the press room with military brass lined up in dress blues. I left the way I had served, quietly, completely on my own terms. I bought a cottage on the coast of Maine. Small, weather-beaten. The kind of house that earns its charm by not trying too hard. White shutters, a screened porch, an old easel in the sunroom I hadn't touched in 20 years. I started painting again, mostly water, sometimes sky. No people. I kept my uniforms boxed in a closet, my medals stored in a drawer I didn't open. The walls held no photos, just quiet. And for the first time in decades, the silence wasn't a punishment. It was peace. Every morning I walked the shore barefoot, let the tide wash over the scars I used to hide. I no longer needed recognition. I had it. I no longer needed revenge. I'd outgrown it. And then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. A boy, maybe 10, stood there with a sack of bread and a receipt. "You're the general, right?" he asked, eyes wide behind wind-blown bangs. I smiled. I was. He blinked. "The one from the wedding video?" I laughed gently. "Yes." But more importantly, I said, kneeling just slightly to meet his eyes, "I never stopped standing up for what mattered." He nodded, like that made sense, like that was enough. And then he ran off, the screen door swinging behind him. Inside, the kettle hissed, the canvas waited. The ocean stretched wide across the window, vast and unbothered. And for the first time in my life, when someone said my name even quietly, I knew they said it with care. Not because they loved me, but because they finally knew they couldn't erase me. And that was enough. Some victories aren't loud. They echo in silence, in knowing you stood tall when others tried to bury your name. Althea didn't seek revenge. She claimed something deeper: respect. If this story moved you, subscribe for more like it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Served Cold. We'll see you next time.